I think we can start this conference. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to LSE for today's hybrid event hosted by Bruegel and the European Institute at LSE. My name is Yaprak Gürsoy. I'm a professor of European politics and the chair in contemporary Turkish studies at the European Institute at LSE. Before we begin, a bit of a housekeeping note. I would like to ask those of you who are in the room to please put your phones on silent. And please also note that we are recording this event and we will make it available as a podcast later on. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to what is truly a significant occasion. This year marks Bruegel's 20th anniversary, and we at LSE are celebrating our own 130th anniversary. So we are deeply honored that Bruegel has chosen to mark this milestone here with us and with the European Institute, which, by the way, is also celebrating its 35th year. So I think collectively we have, 185 years together. So if we cannot solve Europe's challenges here in this room, no one can. For those less familiar with our work, the European Institute is an academic department here at LSE, and we are dedicated to the study of Europe in its global context. Our work spans political economy, politics, policy, culture and society, and migration, through 8 master's degrees, 1 doctoral program, and a vibrant research community and public events program such as this one. Our partnership with Bruegel is particularly meaningful to us. The European Institute, as its name suggests, has long been committed to fostering strong collaboration and dialogue across the Channel. Even as the landscape of UK-Europe relations have evolved, we remain dedicated to our mission to strengthen these intellectual and policy connections. Brussels and world-leading think tanks such as Bruegel continue to be important destinations for our graduates, for our students, and we are confident that they will remain so in the future. Today's conference theme, Security in Europe, how will it affect growth and competitiveness, could not be more timely or relevant to this cross-channel partnership. The UK has demonstrated its commitment to remaining engaged with Europe on defense and security matters, especially in this fast-changing global environment, and the economic implications of this engagement are obviously quite significant. Security and prosperity are intimately linked, although we might dispute how so and in which direction. How Europe, including the UK, addresses the security challenges of our time will fundamentally shape our economic future and our competitiveness on the global stage. But these questions matter beyond policy debates and spending figures or GDP figures alone, because they touch upon the well-being of all of us citizens as diverse and interconnected communities, and since our students are here with us as well as the generations that will follow. So the discussions we will have today and the choices that will be made by politicians about security and economic policy in the short term will determine Europe's geopolitical standing and security. So we are really at a crossroads in some respects. However, these decisions will also have an impact on the quality of life and opportunities available to people across Europe and beyond. So I'm very pleased to be joined by our distinguished speakers today and the 2-3 panels that have been organized to talk about these issues and to think about these complex questions. Thank you all for being here, and thank you once again to Bruegel for this partnership. Now let me give the floor to Jeromin Zettlemeyer, the director of Bruegel, for his opening remarks.
So thank you so much, Yaprak, and thank you all for coming. So it's very clear from Yaprak's introduction who is the junior partner here. We are only 20 years old, not 35, not 130. We look to LSE as an intellectual beacon, a European beacon, a global beacon. And of course, just like the LSE European Institute, we have at Bruegel a broader view of Europe, of what constitutes Europe, than just the EU. The UK was a founding member of Bruegel, and I'm very happy it is still a member of Bruegel. Of course, the UK was a member of the EU when Bruegel was founded. And then when, to my great distress, Brexit happened, we changed the statutes at Bruegel to enable the UK to stay. So it was originally restricted to EU governments. So Bruegel is a weird little place. We are a think tank, but we also have a little bit of a feeling of an international organization. And that's because we are a membership-based organization that distinguishes between government members, institutional members, and corporate members. We have 20 government members at this point. They're all EU plus the UK. We have about 50 corporate members, and we have a bunch of central banks. And so the beauty of the structure is it's diversified. No single member can tell us what to do. They're very independent. All corporates pay the same. If one pulls out, we can survive it. And then, of course, the other beauty of it is that we're not very dependent on project funding. And so I would say that what makes Bruegel special is this institutional DNA. It's the governance structure. So we are very kind of in the economist, what used to be the economist mainstream of thinking that institutions rule and that it's the design of institutions that makes for good performance, whether it's policy, whether it's papers. And so we have a great governance model, which, by the way, was co-created by my colleague Nicolas Véran, who is sitting here in the first row. So we are super happy. We picked with our European Institute counterparts two topics that are particularly hot, and they both are about the nexus of defense and economics from different angles. And I hope you'll enjoy it. And then we will additionally have at the end a fireside chat with a senior. Can I say who it is at this point? I still can't. No, I may not. I can say it later. Okay, we'll keep you in suspense a little more, but you will not be disappointed. I don't want to start my embrace of the UK with a terrible diplomatic faux pas. So you will see.
We'll announce it soon, but I guess quite a few of you already know. So welcome everyone also from my side. I'm Angelo Martelli, an assistant professor in European political economy here at the LSE, and I have the pleasure to chair our first panel. The first panel will look at the financing instruments in the defense space and also at alternative governance mechanisms beyond the current ones. And we'll ask the questions whether there is momentum now for a European defense mechanism with the inclusion also beyond European partners. So it's my pleasure to invite to the stage the first round of speakers. May I ask Domitilla Sagramoso to join us on stage together with Jeromin Zettlemeyer and Sander Tordor. Please, you can take a seat on stage. Please.
What do we do? You sit here, no? Let me sit here. Only you take that.
Okay, so let me introduce briefly our speakers. We are on a tight schedule since this session is going to end at 15:40. So we start with Domitilla Sagramoso, who is actually a senior lecturer in security and development in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Her contribution will be followed by Jeromin Zettlemeyer, then needs no introduction by now. And then we will have Sander Tordor, who is the chief economist at the Center for European Reform. This will be followed by our discussant, who is Pierre Albron. You can also join us on stage already now if you want, unless you want to look at the presentation slide. But he's the outgoing special envoy for Ukraine's relief and reconstruction for France, and also the former EBRD vice president. Thank you all for joining us. Domitilla, you have the floor now for 10 minutes. I'll move there to check for the slides.
Yeah, shall I tell you to change it?
Oh, I can give you the clicker if you want.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Jeromin and to Bruegel and the LSE for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure. Can you all hear me also at the back? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try to be as quick as possible and try to squeeze in quite a lot of info. So please forgive me if there are things that I might skip because we're sort of on a strict time frame. But what I wanted to do basically was to sort of set the scene and to try to discuss what are Russia's intentions and Russia's capabilities. And the first question that I would like to ask is to what extent, do we find ourselves, at war with Russia? And I think that the answer to me is pretty clear, because the way that Russia understands warfare is not primarily related to kinetic activities. It involves what is now usually known as hybrid warfare. As just a few examples, Russia carries out covert activities by its spy vessels. It also has carried out maritime and airspace violations quite regularly, and this has forced, for example, NATO fighter jets to scramble 570 times in 2025. So it's been really quite aggressive. It has also carried out many sabotage operations in countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and there are sort of networks of individuals that have coordinated many of these activities. So Russia really has operated at this level very effectively and very actively. And last but not least, it has also become quite engaged in supporting pro-Russian parties in European elections and in national elections in European countries. So this is really what I would describe sort of the Russian way of carrying out warfare, where Russians understand warfare as a combination of conventional military activities, threats of the use of nuclear weapons, and also, last but not least, the utilization of information warfare, which are primarily sort of often involve also kind of what we call psychological cognitive operations. And this is what really we have in mind, is this idea that Russians are operating in the adversary's mind. It's a battle for the minds to convince the opponent, first of all, that fighting Russia is futile. There's very little chance that Russia will be successful, that the enemies of Russia will be successful in fighting and defeating such a big and powerful country. And secondly, also very important to argue that their operations and their activities are really very much in the right. So, Russia is carrying out, has a legitimate and valid argument as to why it is carrying out these kind of activities. And also, if we see the way that Russia has operated, especially since Vladimir Putin has come to power, he has tended to use military force very much as an instrument of policy to achieve its, Russia's geostrategic objectives. At least, if we think of the years that he's been in power, there have been very few years where Russia has not been engaged in full-scale warfare. And some of these years, for example, from 2009 to 2012, 2013, have been the years where Russia has really revamped and modernized its armed forces. So this is a bit the scene. And now let me say a few words about Russia's capabilities. As we all know, Russia has been trying to build a much more substantial armed force involving hopefully 1.5 armed servicemen by the next few years. And what is important to bear in mind when we think about the numbers is that the objective is not to build a highly trained, very effective armed forces, but to put an emphasis on numbers. Because this is what really sort of satisfies or helps with what we call the Russian way of warfare in particular, which is a war of attrition. Russia tends to rely now more effectively on attrition. than in what we usually would call combined armed forces warfare, which is what NATO countries usually try to carry out. So at the same time, the Russian economy or the Russian government has really ramped up arms production. And although many of the quality of the equipment is not high end, it's still quantity which really is very significant. And just to give you a few numbers, for example, Russia is now able to produce 4.2 million rounds of ammunition in a whole year. And that is a ramp up from 0.4 million in 2020. It produces around 400 Shaheeds per day. So that's a Shaheed drone. So that's really quite significant. Also, what is important to bear in mind is that Russia is also trying to develop high-tech capabilities. And there are areas where the Russians have, to a certain extent, I wouldn't say excel, but they've been really cutting edge. For example, when we talk about fiber optic drones, when we discuss, for example, electronic warfare, unmanned surveillance instruments, hypersonic missiles. So there are many areas where the Russians have been able to operate, at sort of a high-tech level. Also, what the defense spending is being ramped up. You can see figures in the slides. The projection for 2026 is that 40% of federal spending is going to be spent continuously on defense. So we are really at a situation where Russia is really moving increasingly to war footing situation. Now, if I have a few minutes, I would like to say a few words about Russia's intentions, because as I think war studies always discuss, you need to match capabilities plus intentions. And in this case, what I think is important to highlight is that, of course, Europe is a target, because Europe is now the key country that has been supporting the Ukrainian war effort, and that's where Russian military capabilities and intentions are currently focused. So as the key providers of financial support and military support to Ukraine, Russia carries out these hybrid operations to make sure that there is an end to weaken European support for Ukraine's war effort. So that's kind of the obvious immediate aim. There's also the sort of always long-standing aim of Russia, which has been to weaken NATO, primarily from a political point of view. So the idea is not so much to defeat NATO militarily. Russia is fully aware that it is carrying out, if it engages with NATO, it would be what we call an asymmetric encounter. It doesn't have the ability to defeat NATO military capabilities, but it can reduce its effectiveness by operating, maybe by carrying out small operations, which may paralyze decision-making and weaken the resolve of the countries to respond. And this is what especially relevant if we consider the role of the United States. There's always been the aim since the Cold War by Russia to decouple, at the time the Soviet Union, to decouple the United States from Europe. Also, one of the arguments that I think is relevant is the question of what does this war represent for the Putin system and the Putin regime? And I think here what we need to bear in mind is that now Putin has really embraced this war, and his regime is very much dependent on a successful outcome. So I think it's unlikely that we see a negotiated settlement where Russia makes major compromises, because that would not only weaken potentially the Russian state from the Russian point of view, but it would also weaken potentially the Russian regime. And a lot of questions are going to start to be asked as to what were the costs involved in terms of blood and treasure, and how much effort has been done for just a result which is not fully satisfactory. So we could see that Russia and the regime, engage in what we call sort of permanent warfare. So in a couple of years, after a peace agreement or a sort of a ceasefire is reached within the Ukrainian context, we could see the Russians engaging in more assertive operations along NATO's borders. And on the other hand, what one could argue that if Russia succeeds and Ukraine is eventually, to a certain extent, subdued in some form or other, then we would find ourselves in a situation where I think Putin's hubris, would start playing a part, and he would be maybe carried away to continue further. And I think here what is important to note is that from the Russian and Putin's point of view, there is this desire to a certain extent to change the configuration of the European security architecture and also to modify, if possible, the borders of the Russian state as it is today. Since the end of the Soviet Union, there's been a big discussion about what is Russia, where do the borders lie? And most people, find themselves very uncomfortable in the current borders of the 1991 borders of the Russian Federation. So, the mental map, the geographical mental map of what Russia means to Russians is very much linked to what was the Soviet Union. And, also Putin highlights the relevance even of what was the Russian Empire. So here we're talking also about Finland, of course, the Baltic states and other countries and, Poland. I don't want to even mention it, but yeah, it was part of the Russian Empire. Of course, I think the last point, if I have a minute, is to highlight three important limitations to Russia's sort of assertiveness. And I'm sure that there's going to be more of a discussion of this in terms of the challenges to the Russian economy, fiscal pressures, overstretching, challenges with inflation, no access to critical technologies, very limited. And also, another important point is the weak performance of the Russian armed forces, especially if we consider their efforts they've carried out over the last 4 years, have not been able to advance significantly besides to what was achieved in the first year of the war. And the final point is really what would be the reaction at home and to what extent there wouldn't be opposition to, a more assertive policy involving military forces again, and this kind of adventurism that Putin has carried out. I think I'm going to stop now. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Domitilla, for setting the stage. We actually wanted Domitilla to go first in a way in the lineup because she's an expert on Russia's foreign policy and security, and in a way gives a sense of why we're all here and where it all started. Jeromin, I yield the floor to you. We should, yes, have your presentation ready. And
thank you so much. So super and great scene setting. So this is based on a paper, actually several papers we did with Guntram Wolf, who is sitting here in the first row, and Armin Steinbach, who is now the chief economist in the German Ministry of Finance. And the topic is basically how to rearm fast and more cheaply than what we are doing. And so there are 5 impediments in the status quo of doing that to deal with the joint threat. It's a joint European concern, of course. So through the lens of an economist, there's a lack of competition. We have very strong home bias in procurement and for the military. We have, many national champions. About something like 80% of French military spending goes to French companies, about 60% of German to German companies, and so forth. Second, and this is well known, well advertised, there's a lack of scale. So we tend to sort of measure our military procurement in the dozens of tanks, not in the hundreds of thousands or 10,000s. And so there's a clear correlation between cost and scale. There are some missing technologies, so I put a few examples up there, but there are many, many more. And then finally, there's an issue that is a bit broader and has to do with fiscal fragmentation. So we do not have, of course, a unified fiscal authority. And what that does is it prevents the development and financing of common strategic enablers that benefit Europe as a whole. It also creates some free riding on the countries that, even though they produce a positive externality, a defense externality for the rest of Europe, do not get sufficient funding support from the rest because their own, in a sense, private costs of exposure to Putin are so high that they nonetheless go through this extraordinary effort. You can argue that credit market failures are facing new entrants are another problem. In my view, it is not the main problem. The main problem is on the demand side of the procurement market. So the implications of all of this is that rearmament is expensive and slow to the extent that we need common defense assets, and we need them increasingly if we think that the US may not reliably provide them in the future. Currently, they are provided by the US. So this is about intelligence, satellite systems, refueling in the air, strategic lift, nuclear deterrence, potentially. These will just not happen because you cannot afford them on a country by country basis, and we have too little defense spending in total because these externalities are not internalized. So I have just two more slides. What's the solution? So we can do this in two steps. The solution is you can define it functionally if you wish, and then you can ask how do we implement this institutionally. So functionally, you solve the lack of competition the way we have done it on the European continent. In general, you create a single market for defense-like production in Europe. And this means three things. Mainly, and most importantly, it would mean non-discrimination against producers from other countries of the single market, some control of state aid, and probably also a common export control regime. So these are the three features of such a single market. Now, the reason why it is so difficult to do this is because security is explicitly taken out of the single market's obligations of the EU. So in a sense, the good news for the UK is that there's a level playing field here because this single market doesn't exist even in the EU right now. Right? And it's legally impossible to create it in the EU because of this exemption for national security related items. The lack of scale problem has a relatively simple solution concept: joint procurement, whenever possible, at a minimum, new technologies or standardized technologies, and then try to standardize more. So even if there is no joint procurement, if you have standardization, more countries will procure the same thing. Missing technologies, we think, would be addressed over time if you create a lot of more dynamism in this market, and that's the whole point of competition and scale. And then importantly, and ignore the EDM reference in this bullet, this is a leftover from the previous version. So you would need some vehicle to both own and fund common defense assets, right? And the idea is that you would then distribute the interest costs to the community of European countries that does that. Okay, so these are in principle where we need to go, and then in principle, we think there are two ways of doing it. So the one that we sort of pushed that Angelo was referring to, so we wrote a paper of this for the informal meeting of European finance ministers that was also attended by the UK Chancellor in Warsaw in April of last year. Unfortunately, only the finance ministers were there, not the defense ministers. So we basically suggested a new international organization, treaty-based from scratch, analogous to the European Stability Mechanism. And so the idea here is that this is treaty-based. It would be open to all European democracies, including Ukraine, maybe Canada. I don't know how far we want to stretch the definition of Europe here, but we thought geographical Europe effectively. And this treaty would establish the single market as part of what is in it, the definition of the treaty. It would establish a process for standardizing products, a secretariat that would do procurement. It would prohibit national procurement in areas that are designated for common procurement. And then finally, importantly, it would have a funding capability, right? So just like the ESM, it would be capitalized. It could go up or in the markets, purchase common defense goods that would then remain in common ownership. So very unlike, for example, the next generation EU funds, which are to some extent vulnerable to the standard Germanic anti-moral hazard argument, right? So you raise a whole bunch of money that everyone needs to fund, and then you give it to one country that largely has control over this funding. It's not completely true because under NGU, of course, the use of funds is constrained by conditionality. But this would be even more constrained. There would be no national control over the common funds. It would be a common administration of these funds. So this is one way of doing it. Now, when we presented this in Warsaw, we got a fair amount of support from the Poles. Certainly, they like this a lot. From the Eastern Europeans, from the Nordics, The Southern Europeans, they were sort of neither here nor there, but I think the common funding idea also attracted them. The UK was very much in favor, as far as I understood back then. This is not, of course, I don't know the official position on the UK, but that was the sense I got. And Germany and France didn't really like it, right? And they probably didn't really like it for different reasons. You know, France has a long tradition of defense industrial nationalism that would be broken here. And Germany has a bit of that too, but mainly Germany didn't like it for, you know, standard Germanic reasons, you know, common debt, and, you know, new international institution. Why do we need yet another one, right? So we basically went and did another version of this proposal that was without an EDA. And so here we also, maybe this whole thing was UK friendly. That's another possibility. So we did another version that would be based on existing EU institutions as much as possible. Now, the point is, even if you do this based on EU institutions as much as possible, you cannot get away from the fact that you need an intergovernmental treaty for the defense single market, because whatever commitment you do under EU law would not be enforceable at the ECJ, because any country violating that commitment could point to the fact that by, which article is it? 346. That Article 346 of the TFEU, Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, explicitly rules out an obligation in this area, right? So you couldn't, of course, voluntarily cooperate, but the whole point about this is that this is an area where voluntary cooperation doesn't work. I mean, even the involuntary single market requirements are sort of really hard going all the time. So you need really hard commitment, hard legal commitment. You cannot get this in the framework of EU law, so you need to do it intergovernmentally. So we call this a defense compact along the lines of the 2012 fiscal compact. It can be done. And of course, the beauty is that other countries could be a member. So you don't need EU countries only for this. And then everything else you can do within the framework of current institutions. So you can recast the European Defense Agency as a joint procurement, standardization, and so forth agency, which it is not. You know, building on some commitment not to national procure in certain defense areas, which would be in that treaty. You have PESCO, which is the what's it called? The permanent, no. It's a cooperation form under the Lisbon Treaty, which is okay, and it's very flexible, and you can have non-EU countries. It's being used for essentially joint military projects now. You can use this as a framework for the development of these new strategic enablers. And finally, and this is the most critical point, the ownership of funding of strategic enablers would be by the EU. So that is the critical difference between the two proposals. And so this has one huge advantage, which is that whatever debt is issued would be fungible with the existing EU debt. And you do not need to create a new debt issuing function. The people are there, they know how to do it. They are doing it, you don't need a credit rating, you can be much faster. So this is a big plus. The minus, of course, is that the UK and other non-EU countries would not be owners of these structures. So you would need an extra arrangement for them where you effectively extend the benefits of the common defense assets to them contractually, and then you make them pay a service charge. And the service charge would be effectively the share of the interest cost times country size or something. So you can approximate the EDM very largely, except for this ownership and funding. There's a trade-off, right? That plus is that you don't need a new institution. The minus is that members would not be exactly on an equal footing. Let me stop.
Thank you very much. Perfectly on time, Jeromin. And thank you for this deep dive into already some solutions being offered. Sander, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So you originally asked me to talk about a proposal, or rather a defense that Stephen Paduano and I mounted of the Commission's reparations loan to Ukraine against the frozen assets, which I think is still relevant if the EU were to ever use those frozen assets. But we had once again underestimated Viktor Orban's capacity to always cave at the last minute for large European deals. And in fact, the EU went for a more classic MFA-style solution, which is fine. So let me shoot from the hip on these very good introductory remarks from the two colleagues. And I have a couple of observations in sets of three. So let me first dispense with the warmongering, or the military Keynesianism, if you will, with three observations. The first is that the public financing challenge here is enormous. EU, NATO countries, plus all European NATO countries, their spending on defense will go from around 500 billion, 400 from the EU plus another 100 billion, to 800 billion by 2030. It's a really, really big increase in public spending. The second observation is that a lot of this was talk, and it's very interesting that you now see this hitting the real economy. So Germany, which has been in industrial malaise for 5 years, has seen the first 3 consecutive months of rising industrial production. Even though exports are declining, there's not much private demand. And the one reason is that defense orders are through the roof. So there's something really happening in the economy now. So you have a funding challenge, which is not great for public finances. You have a little bit of growth effects. And then the third observation, and I'm borrowing here from Barry Eichengreen and my former colleagues at the ECB, which is that some of this has actual implications for the international role of the euro and may actually lower funding costs for Europe to an extent. So what Eichengreen and co-authors show in a number of publications in the 2010s is that having military strength and being able to provide security for friends and allies actually increases their propensity to hold your currency. In other words, the stronger Europe gets militarily, the more it might be able to provide friends and allies like Turkey or Japan or others with the security, which in turn will lead them to hold more euro reserves. By their estimates, in the case of the dollar, that can be an effect of up to 30 percentage points on reserve holdings. It's a huge effect, which is, for example, why Germany holds almost all of its reserves in dollars, because it's reliant on the US security shield, and France holds almost none of its reserves in dollars. You see the same if you compare Saudi or Russia. So 3 pieces of military Keynesianism to set us off. Then through 3 observations on funding. And I largely agree with the paper of Jeromin and co-authors. I think they found the sweet spot of what you can actually realistically do. Let me dispense with 2 really bad ideas that keep popping up in the debate. The first is that this is somehow about private finance and we need a European bank. How many of you are going to buy a tank anytime soon? Nobody. The only buyer of military kit is government. There is no private funding problem. Private finance will follow if the public orders come in. This is a very particular market. And if we lack, let's say, cheap funding, then in the paper that I'm not presenting today, Paduano and I show that the EIB has 200 billion in excess lending capacity because it's the most conservative policy bank on the planet. So you could send the EIB into battle any day if that's the issue. The second observation on the funding side is that this coalition of the willing notion that somehow you can do it with the 6 or Scandinavia plus Germany is, as Jeromin explains in the paper, is of course not true because you don't have an issuer. The only way in which you have an issuer is if you have either use the EU or you set up a new intergovernmental agency like the ESM. My third point, the ESM, sometimes the French colleagues like to say, well, why don't we use the Eurozone's money box that's sitting unused in Luxembourg because we now have NGU and the ECB is a more modern central bank, et cetera, et cetera. But you can't just switch the ESM to doing defense, right? That is a huge political economy challenge. So maybe, but then you end up basically with Jeromin's proposal, which I would support, but you can't just wish it away and you would have to replace the Eurozone's firewall function in another one. Then 3 points on governance. One slightly critical, Jeromin, otherwise I completely endorse the paper. The first observation on governance, I think there are 2 sort of problems that you didn't list in your 5. One is on contracting. So there's a very interesting literature on World War II and how the design of contracts meant that the US outperformed Germany in terms of industrial production. And that is a question of do you use cost contracting, cost plus contracting, cost plus a fixed fee contracting, and of course, standardization, right? So the US really went for the Sherman tank, and you produced them in mass numbers. The B-17, you produced them in mass numbers. The Germans were producing all sorts of hobby horse kit along the way, and that was very expensive. So I think there's a question of design of contracts. The US model was a bit more expensive because they gave a fixed profit margin per contract to companies, which allowed them to scale up quickly. The Germans in 37, 38 switched to cost contracting and standardization, which meant that by 1944, their production was higher than in 1940, remarkably, despite all the bombings. And we have to really think about how we want to design the contracts. The second challenge, I think, that you're sidestepping a bit is the veil of ignorance problem. So countries, I think, will not sign on to the scheme that we both want unless they know which of their firms are going to win out to some degree from a European scheme. And so we have to think about, I think, conceptually, there are two models. Either we have member states specializing in different things. Let's say the Dutch do radars, the Germans do tanks, the Poles do drones, the French do planes, and then you share the spoils like that. Or you force companies like that Airbus and Rearmament are already doing to basically smear their factories across the EU.
Right.
And the third one, which we can get into, is just the fiscal compact wasn't really a very successful instrument. So I'm not so sure it's the template.
It's our lawyer who brought it into the paper. It's a legal, it was supposed to be a legal example. Not
Okay, it's a good legal example, but governance-wise, we need buy-in, and then you can do it in various ways. Then three political observations to close with. The first is that France and Germany are indeed the problem. Look at the two big Franco-German defense projects, FCAS Joint Fighter Project, the Irish Joint Satellite Project. Germany is literally on the cusp of exiting both those projects because they feel like these are basically ploys by France to get access to German defense money for their defense companies, and probably there's something to that German anger about it. And I think that is, whether or not they leave those projects, they can live on as zombies. But we do have really a Franco-German problem, and the wider relationship, I think, is not in good shape after the spat over Mercosur, after the spat over Buy European. So one critical political space to watch. The second political space to watch would be the EU budget negotiations, which I think have profound implications for whether we can do defense Eurobonds. If there is a failure to cut back on agricultural subsidies, to cut back on cohesion policy, there is no world in which the Dutch, the Germans, and some of the Scandinavians are going to agree to Eurobonds. So the MFF reform being successful, I know the EU budget is a tough cookie to talk about, but it matters. And then my last observation on the politics is that in a world in which we're spending 300 billion more over the next few years on defense, there won't be a lot of money for climate. There may actually not be even that much money for economic security. And so I think the more that we can think dual use, for example, can we force defense companies to buy, let's say, relatively cleanly produced rare earths at a higher price in Europe or allied countries, create a market for it to get off of the China dependence? I think that's really where a lot of policy potential is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sander. Pierre has now the easy task to respond to these three great contributions. The good thing is that we have a second panel later, which will touch upon a lot of the issues that were raised, like defense capabilities, procurement, R&D. So don't feel obliged to cover those in
cover everything.
Pierre, you have the floor.
No, but thank you very much, Angelo, and thanks for these very insightful contributions. I'm here also quite free since I left my job as President Macron special envoy on Ukraine, and obviously having the views from the experience and inside the political economy bubble, which I experienced in the last 3 years, maybe to react to some of what you said. And not very much, I think, on your scene setter, because I think it gives it depicts very well, more or less, what is at stake, and also both the aims and the instruments Russia is deploying in front of us. But maybe on also what you said. So first remark is that we are not still there, and we probably should think why we've not been quicker and more effective in deploying good ideas like the one you, Jeromin, and colleagues have put together. We've done things, by the way, you didn't mention, but yes, which shouldn't be overlooked. I think, obviously, in terms of macro-financial assistance, EDIP, the removal of some exemptions from the EIB lending policy, obviously SAFE. So we've not done, and I think it's fair to say that that all of that is something, but we really need a step change, and we've been too cautious and too slow. That's for sure. And moving from speeches, you said very well that there is something which has been changing also in the market and in the ways actors are looking at defense issues. I think both in Germany, but in many countries have been too. Probably France has been the country which, because of the structure of the industry, has sometimes the most reluctance to think about more or less doing with others and doing, by the way, with Ukraine, because it's the very big issue. It's how can we make more or less of this situation the starting point of a successful integration process where Ukraine becomes a strategic asset for Europe, and that we take more or less this opportunity, more or less in a Draghi style way, to increase our competitiveness and create jobs in Europe. What you said is extremely true. And that leads to my second point, that we need a decisive political impetus from the highest level. You mentioned, Jeromin, that you presented the paper to the informal ECOFIN. In fact, what strikes me, having spent a lot of time in these discussions, both at national European level and in Ukraine, is that there is a huge difficulty in making defense ministries, foreign ministries, and finance ministries work together. Probably it's easier, by the way, in Brussels, because you don't have 2,000 years of sometimes infighting, which happens in countries which have the habit or tradition to wage wars, like France or Germany. But I think that's a major problem, because and explains, by the way, why we've not used the opportunities linked to the ERA loans, to the peace facility, all the ideas using and tapping into also the frozen Russian asset, and now the 90 billion decided by the European Council. If we are not able to put together ministers of finance and ministers of defense, the ones logically ministries of finance will be only interested in economic and financial incentives and reducing the taxpayer exposure to a new scheme, and ministries of defense who honestly have not Europe or cooperation as their standard charter, and don't get up of their bench saying, oh, we should cooperate with our German friends or with our Ukrainian friends or with our great inventors in Estonia of new drone technologies. I think nothing will happen. And that requires a huge leadership from heads of states, in putting not only nice speeches about war economy, but tried more or less translating these speeches in concrete action plans, which are based on all the right principles you mentioned. So a clear idea, which, by the way, Jean Monnet had, creating the coalition community, which is breaking this fragmentation, breaking also these seeds of nationalistic behaviors in an area where obviously, and that reflects the other, the competence at the European level is limited in legal terms. So I think that is the second point I want to mention, because it's sometimes overlooked, or we are surprised that it doesn't move. And it's also linked to the sense of urgency, having been very much involved in the response to the financial crisis, the COVID crisis. And for the financial crisis, it took a very long time. The Greek crisis, many different attempts, many nights and days of discussions. COVID was quite a different thing, because at least the perception of the threat is extremely important to motivate politicians who have afterwards should make a platform which is attractive to their voters. And I think while during COVID, everybody could understand that your mother, your cousin would probably feel bad and even die from this. For Ukraine or the Russian threat, we've not built, or we are building progressively, a perception or awareness that we are confronted to what economists would say is symmetric shock or a common nightmare.
Yes.
And for the time being, more or less, it has appeared in the last 5 or 6 months. Or also, the change of behaviors of actors is linked to that, and the change of behaviors or approaches of our leaders will depend on that, and we should very much work on these politics, because we have to build political narrative saying that it's in the interests of our citizens in Europe, because it will create jobs, that we are not just throwing money to Ukraine just to cover the gaps, because the US are nowhere to be seen nowadays on that. But we have to say it will change the European project, because it will strengthen Europe. And it will be my last point. I think being more creative in learning from Ukraine, and this vitality sometimes coming from Kiev and from the whole country being more European than European themselves, I think is a very important element, to be creative, not to be too stuck into the legal details, because generally we are quite good when there is political impetus to find legal solutions to do that, but also to create this toolbox of instruments linked to de-risking and to the pooling of risks of some project not being completed to the end, because being able to define together in a centralized manner, in a standardized manner, what we need to produce, and that more or less requires discussion with Ukrainians, with member states, saying, what the needs are for the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and how we will cover the needs. And I think on many of these issues, we'll discover that obviously Ukrainians, who now cover 48% of their needs with their own production, local production, while it was 2% 2 or 3 years ago, have a lot to offer to us, in fact, and do it jointly in the future. So I would just very much echo, in a positive way, I think, the fact that the problem is probably to have a discussion which obviously provides a step back from these national instincts, which are more prevalent in this sector than in any other sector. Yes. And have also the leadership capacity based on a common awareness at the political level in each of our member states.
Thank you very much, Pierre. I think you brought back the politics in the political economy issues that were presented by the previous speakers. And also, I think importantly on your point that looking at Ukraine, not anymore just a problem that needs to be solved, rather an opportunity and a strategic asset, as you said, in this new geopolitical dimension that we're building. We have a bit of time for questions. So I see a lot of hands up. Let's take these first 3 questions. I think there should be growing mics coming to you very soon. So Nicolas, should be on already.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Nicolas Veron at Bruegel, and thanks very much for super stimulating presentations. My question is reacting to the point that Sandra made, but actually is directed more to Domitilla and to Pierre. You referred to the decision in December not to go for the reparations loan, and you implicitly or explicitly blame Viktor Orban. I think that's very diplomatic, but those of us who observed that interesting sequence got the impression that actually the real obstructionist here was Belgium and managed to block the decision, at least for the time being, which is kind of puzzling because Belgium is not usually viewed as an obstructionist for important European decisions. And so my question to Domitilla and Pierre is, what lessons did we learn here? Maybe, of course, the answer requires a theory of why Belgium obstructed. To the kind of expert observers, the arguments they gave about the financial risk to Euroclear or that kind of thing didn't make any sense. So there is an assumption that the reason was different. One hypothesis is just plain Russian intimidation. That may be the case, but maybe not. So if so, what did we learn in terms of European vulnerabilities and the decisions we can and cannot make? I would be very interested in your views on this interesting episode. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we take the third row. Yeah, third row. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather Gravy from Bruegel. I promise there will be questions surely to non-Bruegel people. But, so the biggest issue that you haven't brought up today is time. Jean Monnet said Europe will be forged in crisis, but often the forging takes an incredibly long time to negotiate in Europe. And Donald Trump is pushing us all the time. If he does try and get some kind of ceasefire before the midterms, that will give Russia an opportunity to rearm while not bogged down in the front line. And I think that Dr. Sagramozo's point about Russia is building up quantity rather than quality tells us something about what kinds of capabilities we need to be funding. And at the moment, the politics in Europe is much more around the kind of large-scale, very expensive weapons platforms that our contractors like. So how can we speed things up to start funding the kind of defenses that are likely to be needed against the kinds of capabilities that Russia is actually building? So to boil down to it, which of the proposals you've presented today could be rolled out fastest?
Thank you very much. And the last one, you can see the lady in green.
Thank you so much. So my name is Katerina. I'm from Ukraine. I'm a specialist for Ukrainians. It is very interesting, and I'm happy to hear you. Especially, I have a thanks to Mr. Jeromin Zettlemeyer for saying geographical Europe. Like as Ukraine is a geographical center of Europe is in Ukraine, so it's extremely pleasant to hear that. So I have two short questions. First to Dr. Domitilla Sargamoso. So you mentioned that Russia is already in the war with Europe. And how do you evaluate the understanding in European Union and in the UK, the fact that if Ukraine falls, if Ukraine is made to surrender, then the war will be in the EU, will come to the EU, and Ukrainians will be forcibly mobilized to Russian army to fight against the EU. And especially considering the fact that the amount of people who are willing to fight and die for their countries in Europe is much, much smaller than in Ukraine. And one more question for Mr. Pierre Halbron. Thank you so much for this. Well, it was honest, but direct that Ukraine is an asset for Europe, and it can be used in the war can be used opportunity to create jobs in the EU. I'm wondering why in the EU, not in Ukraine? Ukraine has a lot of people who can work. We hear a lot that EU is sick of supporting Ukraine, and which is cynical but true. I can understand. But if there are factories which are built in Ukraine, produce, there are jobs for Ukraine. Ukraine creates money for itself, and everyone is in plus.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 8 minutes more or less to answer these questions. So who would like to take the floor first? Domitilla probably at the end. Do you want to go first, Sander, and no, she wants to go at the end.
Oh, you
So,
want to go?
yeah,
I mean, I can go first.
go first, Jeromin.
Okay, so basically, I only had one question from Heather. So it's a great question. Actually, I wanted to ask a similar question to Domitila, because I mean, the thing is, what we're asking for is a big governance change. Normally, the argument is that you'd only get these governance changes, at least the decisions, in crisis situations. So one interpretation is that we're not enough in a crisis because Putin, may take 5 years to invade. It's not tomorrow. Another interpretation, which I think underlies your question, is that, in fact, perhaps our answer to Europe's rearmament problems presumes the luxury of time, because we need to build a new institution, get it going, and so forth. And indeed, that argument is sometimes made, which is, Jeromin, Guntram, Armin, this is all very nice, but you are talking about longer term changes to the structure of the European defense market and European institutions. And we need something right now. And because we really need it right now, we need to do it exactly within the existing structures. Answer is absolutely we don't. Okay, but what is then the solution? Well, there are two. One is that we can point to EBRD being created out of nothing in 9 months. That's probably a good one, but we have already lost a year. I mean, when we presented this in April, I mean, I had some hopes that by now we would have it. And then we wouldn't be saying, oh, it's not fast enough, right? If we would have it. Okay, but if there is truly a sense that we're not going to start investing in some new structure when we need results immediately, what you can do is essentially a project version of our idea. So what you would take is, take 5 procurement projects, decide that no, we're not talking about building a joint tank or something like that. It's not cooperation on the supply side. It's cooperation on the demand side. It's about procurement. We, on a project-specific basis, commit to non-discrimination against other suppliers, and possibly we even do common funding for it. If we were to announce something like this, and then we get the EDA or PESCO to advance, I mean, you could do it, right? You could do it essentially case by case. And if you put together 5 or 6 big procurement projects, drones, something like that, you would have, that would be headline grabbing, that would be precedent setting, and then you can formalize the whole thing. So that would be my answer.
Thank you, Sander.
Yeah, maybe on Nicola's point. So why didn't I criticize Belgium? I think Stephen and I probably got ourselves canceled in Belgium for the paper. So I didn't see a need to dig my grave any deeper. I do think I agree with you. So what we try to show in the paper is that all the courts in which Moscow could sue Euroclear in Belgium, including the higher courts, Russia has not even acknowledged the jurisdiction of those courts. So the legal claim seems very thin indeed, which is why the only area where Russia filed a lawsuit was in Moscow, as if a Russian court could somehow seize assets in Belgium, which would be unheard of. So it was a weak case. What do we learn from it? One is that smaller member states can indeed be intimidated by Russia. I think that is a very profound implication. The negative one. The positive one is that the EU in the end managed to basically drum up 90 billion in funding, and we froze the Russian assets indefinitely without the 6-month tail risk of a veto. So and that's good because Ukraine still has very large funding gaps. So I think we can return to the issue. And then you and I will argue again that Belgium's legal concerns are overblown, or maybe we'll find another solution. And then on speed, so a little bit the optimistic case in a world in which we don't go for Jeromin et al.'s very good proposal, but we kind of muddle through as we are. McKinsey still estimates that the EU will spend as much on military equipment as the US by 2028. Maybe that's not fast enough, Heather, but it's pretty quick. And that's driven, very much by Germany, but also the Scandinavians, the Dutch, the countries that have the fiscal space. That's maybe not the ideal solution, but something's happening there. So maybe the glass is on what full. Yeah. But on what and how expensive and so on. Right. So there's lots to criticize. Yeah. And the speed should probably be higher, but I'm not completely pessimistic.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and then Domitila.
So maybe on the reparation loan we discussed, Nicola, just before the European Council, I think, you know, the lessons to be learned from that is that there is the political dimension of such a decision is prevalent, I think, on all legal and technical issues. Obviously, it applies to the Belgium reluctance, but also to the overall strategic objective, which was to cover, and that I think is a great success of December, the funding needs for the next 2 years. What has not been very successful is to take this opportunity to discuss about what these funds will be really used for, because I think we risk now missing the opportunity of making this an instrument to create more or less a substantial project of a joint defense basis, at least on the 60 out of the 90 billion euros. And last, I think, in France had, with some other countries, that in mind, that we, in the discussion with Trump and between Trump and Putin, Europe has only one card in its pocket. It's these Russian assets. So it leaves powder dry, and so for a final negotiation where the Europeans will be able to value this asset as it is. The second issue on speed, I think, is very much about tapping into the Ukrainian potential in Europe. I think inviting them, like Denmark and some other countries have done, in creating factories in our countries, which, by the way, meet the needs of the Ukrainians not to have these plants destroyed, learning and doing together, more or less, what our big, at least it's particularly the case in France, but our larger prime producer in defense are not doing. Drones, very cheap and useful, I think, equipments on the front. Not highly technological instruments, but things which are useful in response of a Russian industrial structure, which was very much reminded by Domitille at the beginning. So I think this speed is very much about being much more daring in terms of industrial partnerships and attractiveness of Europe towards also Ukrainian producers.
Thank you very much. Final word.
Thank you so much, Nicola. I think that the question, what I can say is that, you know, Russia really operates on the psychological and the political level very effectively. And so I think that EU leaders need to understand that they are going to be subjected to, you know, to Russian hybrid operations, blackmailing. I really think this is very important, you know, that we understand that there is this way that Russia operates, because I think there was, I haven't been able to verify, but this question that the Belgian Prime Minister felt that he was being sort of pressured in some way, you know. So that was one of his comments, which to me kind of sounded that he was really worried even about his personal security. So I think that Europe needs to work much more effectively in the whole arena of intelligence and, you know, information gathering and human intelligence and operations. I think there is a lot that is there and that is not being uncovered and dealt effectively. And, you know, to have a judicial system that works hand in hand in that respect, you know, I think that is a very important aspect, and I think we need to do a lot more in terms of countering these threats, you know, through intelligence and other kinds of operations. I think that is essential. I think that we really also sometimes you know, Europeans, we really need to stand firm, and this comes to the context where we find ourselves, and I didn't have time to mention it, is that Europe is really facing a double challenge. On the one hand, it has to address the immediate and urgent needs of the Ukrainian war effort and the financial resources that Ukraine needs. And at the same time, it needs to address the challenge that the United States is not entirely abandoning Europe, but its commitment to Europe is uncertain. So Europe needs to worry about its own defense protection. And that is a huge financial challenge, as has been shown. And I would agree with Pierre that here, when we look at what Europe can do, the Ukrainian model is exceptional. I mean, those of us who go there often, we are really amazed when you talk with those who are in the realm of technology and innovation. And one thing that I think is also very important is that first of all, it's really bottom up. I mean, there's a lot of cottage industry that comes and that works directly with the armed forces on the front line, with particular regiments, battalions. So it doesn't go through the structure of government, it's horizontal. This horizontal cooperation, I think, is very effective. And there is also almost competition because there are certain battalions that are very popular, so they work more effectively with the private sector. And there is, I think that what is essential is that we work with the Ukrainians to understand the capabilities and what kind of capabilities our arms industry and our defense products need, because they know exactly the kind of capabilities that are essential to this kind of war, which mixes attrition with a high level of technological innovation, because we have a battle space that is essentially almost entirely transparent. And we are certainly not prepared here in the UK for that. And I think that in the UK, the problem, is the country I've been looking at in greater detail. I mean, we really face a problem in terms of what is being promised and what are the capabilities that are coming out. And if you look at some of the numbers, I mean, the armed forces if we look at the army, I mean, the numbers are smaller today than they were 4 years ago. I mean, there is an awareness and an understanding that there is a threat and a need to operate, but there is fudging of numbers, for example. Apparently there is a 28 billion hole in the defense budget, and the military structures are operating really in very, very dire financial conditions, and they're trying, for example, if we look at the the British Armed Forces, they have a tradition of global exposure or global power projection. So what is being discussed now is that the UK has a kind of a bonsai army. It is very good, but it will operate in a very short time frame. Very soon it might run out of ammunition, might not have the right capabilities. And I think that, I really highlighted, in a very sort of brutal way what we are facing, because I think that European publics are not really aware, are not really understanding what is the challenge that we are facing. And not just, the countries near Ukraine, they know and they're preparing. But in the UK, we also need civilian preparedness. And this is also an area which is lacking. It's another full area of discussion, which requires, a lot of investment, a lot of attention. So thank you.
Thank you very much. As you can see, was very difficult to interrupt this such an insightful discussion. Couple of announcements. I've been given the green light to announce that our closing session will be a conversation with Chancellor Rachel Reeves. And Jeromin will lead that particular conversation. And there is one particular request from our side. When the coffee break ends, and it ends at 4 p.m. sharp, I will ask you to return to the seats in which you're sitting right now. Second announcement is that when the second panel ends, you have to stay in your seats because we will go directly into the conversation with the Chancellor. Okay? Anything else? Okay, good. We have Charles Clover, who is actually the FT Defense and Security correspondent. So I don't have to be keeping time this time around. The next panel is on rearmament, procurement, and modernization of EU and UK defense capabilities, what impact on growth and innovation. And in particular, we will have first contribution by Ethan Ilzeski, who is an associate professor of economics here at the LSE, in our economics department. This will be followed by a contribution by Guntram Wolf, Bruegel Senior Fellow and Professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And then we will have Professor Paolo Surico from the London Business School. This will be ended with a discussion by Lucrezia Reiklin, who is a professor of economics also at the London Business School. Now, without further ado, Charles, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Angelo. Can you hear me? Yeah. So the first panel spoke about why we need to spend more on defense. We heard about the threat, the adversary that Russia creates. We also heard about how to spend this defense budget most efficiently to create a large military deterrent. We heard about procurement, we heard about finance, we heard about contracts and standardization. This panel is going to continue the discussion of how to spend defense budgets, how to spend it efficiently, but also how to accomplish other objectives. We are going to hear how defense money can create economic growth. So in the UK, we call this the defense dividend. This is something that the MOD has kind of patented to describe the positive economic growth that they want to create by spending more on defense. It's sort of the opposite of the defense dividend is the opposite of the peace dividend, which was at the end of the Cold War. We got the same, we got an economic boom by spending less on defense. Now we're getting an economic boom by spending more on defense. You can see what the problem might be. But we also want to create innovation with defense spending. We want defense spending to finance new technologies the way defense spending created technologies like GPS or semiconductors or even penicillin. I think we'll hear about from Paolo. We want defense spending to support small and medium-sized enterprises and startups. We want defense spending to rebuild our manufacturing sector, to rebuild the Rust Belt in our countries. In short, we want these pounds and euros and dollars to do an awful lot of work. This is the way it was put to me by a UK civil servant. And fortunately, we have 4 incredibly gifted scholars who are going to help us, who've been researching this exact topic, how to get the most and how to accomplish these additional goals out of our defense budgets. So we will first hear from Ethan, and then we'll hear from Guntram, then we'll hear from Paolo, then Lucrezia will sum up the discussion. And as Angelo said, we need to finish, I think, at 4:55, right? Sharp. That is a hard stop. And please stay in your seats. Don't be alarmed. Stay in your seats for security reasons. Oh, okay. Here we go. So Ethan, why don't you?
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's nice to be among friends and colleagues here. I'm going to make a few comments about the European and by extension the UK defense expansion, and my colleagues are going to expand on some of these points. I'll expand on those that maybe they're going to talk about less. So a few lessons I think that are worth taking, and I think Charles, in your introduction, you refer to the peace dividend, and obviously you can't both have a peace dividend and a dividend from inverting the peace dividend. But when I started talking to policymakers on this topic about a year and a half ago, there was despair, at least in continental Europe, about the need to rearm. And the thought was, this is going to destroy the European economy, because the thought of a peace dividend was so deeply ingrained in European policymaker thinking that somehow there need to be disabuse from the notion. I'm just going to show you a chart. Obviously, this is not causal evidence of the kind that's expected at LSE, but we see here, defense spending in green in the United States and the European Union, and economic growth, and we can see that, if anything, the correlation is positive here. The peace dividend, there have been attempts to estimate specifically the peace dividend of the end of the Cold War. and the estimates are roughly zero when this is done a little more carefully. But also we have a lot of, literature on fiscal multipliers that I've worked on, that Paulo has worked on, and the multipliers are such that you shouldn't expect to have a very large peace dividend, if at all. And so, the first lesson is don't panic. You can spend more on defense without destroying the economy. As soon as the money was committed, the voices became almost the 180 degrees, and now all of a sudden defense spending was going to be the thing that's going to solve every one of Europe's problems. And now I found myself having to focus more on the no free lunch side, that there's not going to be some magic trick that's going to solve. There are some dividends to be gained from defense expenditures if done correctly, but there's no magic trick here. Okay, and so I'll get into more detail on that. But the first point I want to make, that there are potential productivity gains. And I'm going to talk about three main channels very briefly. And if there are questions later, we can elaborate on them. The first is through the fact that defense spending is very intensive in research and development. And in my regular slides, I have the work of Paulo here, and so I'll let him advertise his own work rather than me doing that. So I'm going to skip that point just because you're going to hear about that later. But that is perhaps the most important channel through which defense spending can give productivity dividends. Another channel that I have studied more carefully is through a phenomenon called learning by doing. I'm showing here charts of learning curves in Second World War, shipbuilding and aircraft building, and mass production that tends to happen with defense expansions do tend to see some productivity gains through a process of learning by doing. But what I emphasize in my own research is that this is not a form of passive learning. You just sit around and produce and you become smarter from that. But actually, this has something to do with technology adoption. It's something where the scale makes you rethink. When you're producing thousands of units, you produce in a different way than when you produce 10 units. So I think Germany's production of tanks was 30 last year. It's going to be different if it's 300. It's going to be different if it's 3,000. There'll be different production technologies that come on board. A phenomenon I call learning by necessity in my own work. And so I think there are some dividends to be gained from those kind of dynamic economies of scale that come with more production. Europe is within the technological frontier, not only on R&D, but also on adoption of technology. And so I think there are opportunities there as well. An example of this, the data is still confidential. I'm not able to access them. But casual observation of the Ukrainian drone industry is that there's been an enormous amount of learning by doing and a lot of feedback loops in production to create a more productive drone sector. A third channel through which productivity gains can be harvested is because, and this is from my work in progress of my own, is that military jobs, actually jobs not only in the defense industry, but actually of the armed forces itself, tend to have high skill requirements. They actually the voluntary army recruits from lower education backgrounds, but then puts people in jobs that have higher skill requirements than the average of the private sector. And veterans of military service tend to actually work in higher skill jobs than the average population. This kind of is strongly suggestive that military service is giving human capital. And here, without getting into details of the mechanics of this chart, you can see that it's specifically in jobs of what I call hard hat skills that the military really excels. And these are exactly the type of jobs that have hollowed out because of competition with China, because of automation, and the military actually could, provide some demand for those occupations that have been left behind. Also, the geography of military jobs is more dispersed. It's finally a place-based policy that actually could work. I don't think I have much time. I'll just say in a few words, I'll say in one sentence that historically, defense buildups have been financed with at least 50% by debt. That is sort of the historical record. We have recent work by Christoph Trebesch and co-authors that documents that. The only question here is whether this time is different, whether we are now in Europe in a situation where we can't compare ourselves to previous episodes, which began at low levels of debt to GDP. Nobody knows where the slippery slope is, but that's kind of a risk we need to think of. And finally, I'll just make a very short comment on the procurement details, and because Guntram is going to talk about that in much more detail. But all the productivity gains that I mentioned before really depend on how the spending is done. It doesn't come just automatically. If 100% of the military equipment is imported, there's no R&D in that. There's no productivity, there's no learning by doing. The jobs aren't going to be there. It's not going to happen. So, unless defense procurement is more localized in Europe, none of these gains are going to occur. There may be a short-run trade-off between procuring things at lower costs from outside Europe and the long-run gains of being able to procure them at low cost in Europe in the farther future. The other thing is that European procurement is painfully fragmented. The only real coordination, formal coordination, is through NATO. And there's a big elephant in the room of NATO that we don't know, that I don't know that's the best point, the best place at the moment for Europe to be coordinating its defense decisions. And so I think new frameworks are required, but I know that Guntram has thought about that. So I will stop here and pass it on to Guntram.
Thank you so much, Ethan. I'm going to have to change my canned intro to this topic now that I know that the peace dividend didn't actually exist. So, so thank you. Guntram, you have the floor. You're going to talk about procurement.
But I first have to flip through the presentation of my. Okay, here I am. Okay, so thanks so much. So indeed, defense spending. We want to have defense spending that achieves all kinds of goals, including growth and so on. But above all, what we need is really defense readiness, and that has, I think, two critical questions that have to be raised in this context. I mean, the first is about tech. Do we get the right defense tech into our procurement? And what I will show you is that a lot of the defense procurement that we are doing is actually done towards rather established big firms, some of them actually doing great things, but basically great things that have become much less effective in an age of modern drone and other warfare as we are seeing it in Ukraine. And the second point is, of course, we need to buy cost effectively. And one key issue is the European fragmentation. We talked about that in the first panel already. Jeromin presented our joint papers. So I'm not going to talk about how do we create a European defense market, but really talk about defense procurement reforms that can be implemented in the current system and that would allow us to include more companies, including startups and high-tech defense companies, into the procurement process that usually don't get into the procurement process. So what do I want to do is I really want to do three things. I want to show you a few slides on procurement and show you that the numbers have gone up tremendously, in particular in Germany, but a lot of that spending is actually relatively ineffective, arguably. Second, I will show you that we really depend on a few big firms, and that's a very big contrast to the United States, where procurement is actually going to many, many more companies and many more SMEs also. And finally, I want to draw on US procurement reforms from the last years. And so let's just walk quickly through the slides. So this is from a procurement tracker that I compiled with a couple of colleagues at the Kiel Institute, where we really have bottom-up procurement data for Germany, for the UK, for Poland, to some extent for France. And we can show, I mean, I think this one is the German one. What we can show is really the pattern over time, but we have really individual products. And what we can see here, the one thing I want you to see here is the scale. The German monthly procurement is now in the order of between 5 and you see the last one in December 25 was 50 billion, right? So in December, 50 billion was passed in procurement, and German procurement by now in 2025 was so big that it basically is the equivalent to almost the rest of NATO Europe combined. So this is really big, and a lot of spending is really done in Germany, and it is done towards a lot towards national champions. This is the UK number. Someone mentioned already the fiscal difficulties in the UK. You see it here towards the end. Procurement really has come down. Also note the scale. The scale is much lower here, right? I mean, here the scale is between 1 and 10 billion. In Germany, it was between 5 and 50 billion, right? So it's very, very big differences. Now, where do we buy? Well, we basically buy a lot domestically. Both the UK and Germany buy domestically, and then they have this greenish area is sort of joint ventures where often there's US companies collaborating with domestic companies. And then we have this very, very tiny bar, which is orange kind of thing, which is basically buying from another European country, right? So if we buy not domestically and not with joint ventures, we buy from the US, which is the pinkish one. So the US is an important source of high-tech defense technology, but for the rest, it's mostly domestic and almost no European market for defense products. This is the US foreign military sales to Europe, where we have compiled a big new database at Bruegel also. And you can see how much it has increased and how much Europe depends really on US high tech. So where does this leave us? Well, I mean, this leaves us with the big problem that the European procurement offices are essentially buying from the top 10 companies, most of which are national companies, and do not buy from a broader set of companies. Here you see Poland, UK, and Germany, all three above 70%. 70% of the procurement going to the top 10, while in the US these numbers are much lower. We are below around 40%, and more than 25% go to SMEs. Okay, so what has the US done? Okay, so I mean, basically there's two ways to deal with this issue. I mean, one is the one that Jeromin presented, our joint paper, right, on how do we create a European market for defense products and basically bring in competition and diversity in the supply of firms. I'm not going to talk about that now, but I do want to draw lessons from 3 US procurement reforms that actually were successful in bringing in smaller companies into the defense ecosystem. And that arguably is important because what we know is that young companies are often technology leaders, right? And the kind of technology that we see now in Ukraine, the bottom-up technology, is very often not coming from the big guys, the established guys, but really from small young companies that are growing. And so the question how we bring in these younger companies, the startups that are building around Munich, around Paris, in London, how do we bring them in the procurement stack is absolutely critical. Okay, the US has 3 reforms. One is called SBIR. They did a couple of things. The most important one is what they call an open competition topics. Howell et al., John von Riene and others have written in the Journal of Political Economy on it. And what they find is really that this reform has been highly successful in bringing in new small companies and scaling these companies and bringing this innovation to the top and really getting these companies to become leaders. Anduril is one example of a company that basically got in through such mechanisms. We can sort of, with worse data than they have, show with a difference estimate that, really the treatment of SBIR works, and it is a way of bringing in these small companies into the procurement stack. The second approach is what the US is doing is called multiple awards. So basically what the procurement offices are required to do is to increase the share of a procurement that goes not just to one company, but to several companies. And when it goes to several companies, one of them at least has to be small. And by doing so, the procurement officers actually have an incentive of not just going for the big companies, but actually building new companies and giving these companies access to future orders. And that has been shown to be quite successful. Again, Anduril is one example, but many other companies have been managing to get into this. And the result is really a substantial increase in the share of SMEs in US procurement in this period since the reforms have happened. And the third issue, which has to do with a lot has to do with information asymmetries also. I mean, we have a lot of very intelligent, smart companies out there that have all kinds of products, and they don't even know whether they are of military use or not. So what this Defense Innovation Unit is doing is basically allowing small companies to easily access the Defense Department. So also a very successful reform, and with different diff estimates, we can show the success of these reforms. So the conclusion, I think we need to bring in innovative small firms into the early phases of the defense acquisition process. The US gives us good lessons. SBR and DIU are useful. Get more players, more than one player involved in development phase. That is critical, because if you do that, you bring in competition, which drives down prices. Multiple award contracts is absolutely critical. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sorry.
The issue of how to get young companies involved in procurement is an incredibly live issue. So thank you for bringing that up. Paolo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about GOAT, the greatest of all times, in the context of military innovation. When I ask this question to my audience, people immediately think about the atomic bomb or GPS or the internet or the computer coming from the brilliance of Alan Turing cracking the Enigma code. Unfortunately, Charles spoiled my line, but actually I'm going to talk of a much softer yet more powerful defense innovation, which is the story of Peninsula. By the way, Bob Lucas used to say economists are just storytellers. I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'm going to show you that actually there's strong empirical regularity behind this story. Penicillin was discovered a few blocks from here at St. Mary Hospital by Alex Fleming, that in 1928, like every year, went on holidays, but just forgot bacteria culture in his petri dish. And when he came back, he realized that mold had grown. But that mold had actually killed the bacteria, and they called that mold penicillin. In the 15 years after that, that mold proved to be very unstable, very unscalable, not for mass production. And it was a pity, because Britain had all the scientists, Germany had all the chemists, but actually the one who did the mass production was the United States. In 1941, through a large government-funded program orchestrated by the Office for Scientific Research and Development, the US decided to spend a lot of money in many different firms, tried to produce at scale penicillin. And it tried well beyond defense. In particular, among them, there was a company, incidentally founded by German immigrants, that was working in the food industry, producing citric acid using a technology called deep tank fermentation. That company that was in food industry and had nothing to do with health was called Pfizer, and is the one that was able, by 1944, to produce in a single plant in Brooklyn penicillin for the entire army of the United States and the Allies. The story I'm going to tell you is that what was crucially different between the United States and Germany was the industrial policy. The United States coordinated government, science, and procurement in all sectors. Focus on production, make clear the coordination between labs, firms, and university. It guaranteed scale and rapid diffusion, and most importantly, guaranteed demand to absorb private risk. The outcome was that while in World War I, 15% of soldiers died not by wound, but by bacterial infection caused by those wounds. In World War II, this was less than 2%. Germany didn't have that, because Germany had a very different industrial policy. Despite having excellent university, excellent chemists, it wanted to go only on value for money, not taking risk, mostly focused on military return. Had a very fragmented procurement system, had very little link between university and firms. Pointing all the money on military, very good to produce weapons, but not to scale diffusion. They never got penicillin, and as a result of that, they were inflicted with a significant high number of causality from bacterial infection. What I tell you is just a story. I could have picked up another one. RNA interference, I will call that PageRank algorithm that drove the foundation of Google, or the 3G network on the genome editing. I told you that economists tell story. Well, let me tell you something else. Don't believe to story by economists. I could have cherry-picked very terrible example. The story here is not that the government knows what to do. Often the government has no clue and the government fails a lot. And here are ridiculous examples, even from the celebrated DARPA. Try to have a microchip into a bug, into an insect, before realizing that drone technology was much cheaper. The lesson here is that you need a systematic approach, going through the entire universe of US patent in the post-war, and trying to figure out what is the role of government funding. We do so by exploiting a new data set in which we can categorize patents according to whether we're funded by the government and developed by the government, funded and developed by the private sector, or public-private entrepreneurship, funded by the government and developed by the private sector. We found that despite accounting for only 2% of the universe of American patent, public-private collaboration actually account for more than 20% of medium-term productivity growth and GDP growth in the United States. Private innovation also make a significant contribution to growth and productivity, but less. And among fully public, most of them are spectacular failure. But the few that succeed are really home run, like the one of penicillin. Why is that? Well, if you compare the agency, NIH and NSF have actually funded innovation that brought economic impact even larger than defense, which also was significant. The reason was that NIH and NSF funded basic research in university research institutes that were not constrained by commercial goals. University research institutes are those that can multiply public R&D by crowding in very significant amount of private investment in R&D. These crowd also in startup and private sector, innovative one. Remember, innovation is destructive. Incumbents don't like innovation because they lose market share. If you want to innovate, if you want to build capacity, you need startup and venture capital. And this is exactly what we find in our result. Which brings me to the conclusion. What I have learned from the story of penicillin, from my own research, the one by Guntram, Ethan, Lucrezia, and many others. Defense spending does not buy you national security. Industrial policy does. An industrial policy squarely centered into government R&D, into innovation, into competition, into risk-taking, and tolerance for failure. When the world was ending, President Roosevelt asked his chief scientific advisor, Vannevar Bush, which lesson the US had learned from the war. And Vannevar Bush wrote a beautiful report, Science, the Endless Frontier, in which identified the 3 pillars and 3 actors. The government, to identifying public interest, now we will call mission-oriented, and provide large support in the form of funding. University Research Institute to push basic research unconstrained by commercial goals. And the private sector competing to turn that new knowledge into new products. I'm mentioning these because every time we compare and we draw a lesson for Europe, we always complain that Europe doesn't have that industrial policy, that ecosystem that America has. This is true, but I want you to know that the US didn't have either. They invented and made that industrial policy. They invented that ecosystem during World War II, thanks to Vannevar Bush and the vision that made innovation, competition, risk-taking, and tolerance for failure critical to that mission. I can only hope that the Draghi report and the commitment to increasing defense spending in Europe will deliver that same result. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Paolo. That was absolutely fascinating on the subject of industrial policy. And now, Lucrezia, it's time for you to sum up all of these.
Okay, so I have to put all these things together. Great. Okay. So what we heard is that security depends on innovation capability. That's what one of Paolo's message. That defense, incentivate innovation. That innovation is linked to growth, and then growth, is important to understand to what extent we are going to self-finance what we have to do in defense. So innovation is really at the center of this panel. So let me talk about innovation and try to link everything. So let me try to organize the discussion around a simple principle. Innovation, whether it is in defense or whether it is on the civilian sectors, requires 3 things simultaneously. And I think this is a way to summarize what has been said. A public anchor to resolve the fundamental uncertainty, institutions that translate experimentation into scale, and then financing at the scaling stage, especially. And all these 3 things are necessary. But what differ between defense innovation and civilian innovation is which one of these 3 things are binding. And I think here what I want to focus on is actually the difference between innovation in the civilian sector and in the defense sector. So let me start with defense innovation. So in defense, the public anchor is very important. This was something that was said actually in the previous panel by Sander. Why? Well, for 3 things. The state defines the mission, the state sets the standards, the state also is the dominant buyer. So this is very important because it has to do with market structure. And of course, the returns are not just private profits, but it's collective security. So that's a public good. So the question is not whether the public sector should be involved, but the real question is what is the constraint that is binding in developing innovation in defense in Europe. Now, Guntram has argued, and I agree with him, that the central bottleneck in Europe is procurement. And procurement is important because it determines who can enter. It determines also who experiments. It determines who survives. And it determines whether experimentation becomes production. So without a procurement reform, higher defense spending risk, entrenching incumbents and foreign supplies, this is not a way to build an innovation ecosystem. Now, Eden adds something which I think is essential and which which was said also by others, but it is that scale really matters. And scale matters for the microstructure. It matters learning by doing, requires volume. This is one of the points of his research. Industrial ecosystem requires sustained demand. Factories must run a scale for productivity gain to emerge. So there is no self-sufficiency, okay, so that we need scale. And so in defense, both institutions and financing are binding in that sense, and they're large in magnitude. So that financing is also important. This was stressed by Eden, and I think this is maybe, and also in the previous panel. So let me get to civilian innovation now. Now, civilian innovation is a bit different. Here, the structural demand is fundamentally different. And okay, we need mission-oriented innovation. That was Paolo's point. This is true also in renewables, in biotech, in AI, and so on. But still, we need a public anchor. So we need public R&D, we need university, we need regulatory frameworks, we need standards, we need all this stuff. But scaling does not depend on procurement. Actually, scaling depends on markets. And this, I think, is the main difference. There are multiple buyers, there are competitive downstream markets, there are private rents, there is exit, IPO, merger and acquisition, export, all that stuff. And so what becomes binding in this case, it is also financing, but of a different type. And, civilian innovation scales primarily through private capital market. And here there is another agenda, which are as important, I think, the procurement agenda, that Europe has a structural weakness, which derives from the fragmentation of the capital market, from the shallow venture capital, weak late-stage funding. This is very important, documented extensively. Conservative institutional investors, lots of fragmentation in a lot of institutions that matters, like IPOs, post-trading services, and so on. So here the problem is not really public budget, but it's financial intermediation. So, so this is different institutional factors, and it's important to distinguish between these two. So I think that Europe has two problems, not one. It does not just have a single innovation failure, it has two failures. The first is where the state is the buyer, innovation is blocked by procurement institution. When markets must scale, this is blocked by fragmentation and incomplete financial integration. So the two are often confused, but I think if we want to fix them, I think it's important to distinguish. Now, let me get to the third factor. So the factor which is something that I care a lot about, which is the macroeconomic framework. And I think here, theory is ahead of policy. We know that structural transformations requires reallocation across sectors. We have to go through structural transformations if we want to build an innovation ecosystem. We know that reallocation demands support. We know that endogenous growth theory tells us that fiscal and monetary policy affect investment and therefore technological progress. So if macro policy is too tight, and here I refer both to fiscal and monetary policy, then firms underinvest, private innovations incentives are weakened, and then potential output may fall permanently. So private innovators require large and growing market to justify scaling. Macroeconomic policy does not substitute for institutional reforms, but without it, neither defense nor civilian innovation can scale. The US experience, late 40s, just post-war 1960s, is very important to understand that. This was just not, what we saw there was not just a wartime stimulus. We saw systemic restructuring, large-scale public demand, institutional redesign, scientific infrastructure, lots of things have been said, but also full employment and sustained investment. So scale, institutional reforms, and supportive macro conditions. That's my third factors. And so I think today's challenge, also in other, not only in defense, but in the green transition, digital infrastructure, and so on, is of the similar magnitude as in those post-war years. And so we have to learn about what was the macro framework that sustained that kind of structural transformation. So let me conclude. I have 3 propositions here in conclusion. The first is that defense innovation requires procurement institutions that allow experimentation and financing at scale that only the public sector can support. The second proposition is that civilian innovation requires public anchoring, but scales primarily through deep integrated capital market. And the third proposition is that Europe underperforms in both because it misaligns institutions and financing. And without a macroeconomic framework that supports the relocation and capacity expansion, neither can scale. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucrezia. That was fabulous. So we have 10 minutes for questions. Should we do it one at a time, or should we take a group of questions? Okay, well, why don't we do a couple of questions at a time? Do we have any? Let's see. Let's have you over there, and followed by you, and then followed by you. Okay. So yes, you go ahead first.
The first part of this series of discussions concluded that there was very little time available. Given the projections of how little time is available, how do you think your offering to the room is relevant in the absence of time?
Okay, and then sorry, who's over there? Yes, in the blue vest.
Thank you. I had a question in terms of comparing Vannevar Bush, like the 40s compared to Draghi now. How much is Europe's wider infrastructure a barrier to innovation, both in defence and I guess mostly in AI, in terms of high energy costs? And if you compare us to China and the US, like 5G rollout, for example.
Thank you. And then over there in the blue blazer.
Thank you. Given that the assertion that 50% of defence spending is typically financed by debt, how do we increase our debt at a time when capital markets basically say, do that and you're going to go down the tubes? Do we all have to increase our debt at the same time for the sake of national security?
Okay, thank you.
It should be asked to Rachel Reeves.
Yeah, we can ask the next guest actually too. So time available, and then European energy costs and infrastructure, and then how to increase borrowing capacity.
So I mean, I can take the borrowing capacity question. So I mean, at the European, I will not talk about UK borrowing right before the Chancellor walks into the room. So I'll leave it. You can ask her. At the European level, I think different countries in Europe have different constraints. And therefore, those who can should borrow, and we are seeing that already with Germany. But also, there is a rationale. Defense is a European public good, and there's a rationale to collectivize borrowing for that. And so I think that using Europe's collective fiscal capacity to a greater extent would allow Europe to expand even further.
On the point about the time, do we have time? I would postulate that instead of thinking that by directly going on the procurement market immediately without public tender and without competition, you actually increase both cost effectiveness and timely delivery by actually increasing the degree of competition in defense markets. And I think that's something that unfortunately, most of defense officials do not understand. I mean, they have a tendency of just going for established relations with their incumbent companies, their national champions. The result is that these kind of national champions will have an incentive to underinvest into production capacity because they can exploit their monopoly power towards the single buyer. And so this is a fundamental problem. And I think the solution really can only be you have to increase competition. You have to bring in additional firms because only then the companies have an incentive to actually build capacity, production capacity quickly, and have that production capacity available to actually get the orders. If you don't do that, I do think you continue to overpay. Allow me to say one word on the fiscal. Yes, I mean, a lot of defense spending has historically been with debt. Germany is now doing it 100% with debt, basically. I mean, it's all debt funded. And there was a big debt reform, debt rule reform, debt break reform in Germany for that. Now, to be honest, while I was in favor of that reform, not of that specific reform, but of a reform in general, I think the end result has become really a result where a lot of defense spending is actually done without regard to cost effectiveness. And I think that's a constraint. The removal of the fiscal constraint really has led significant parts of the political players just to say, okay, let's just spend on whatever and let's do it quickly without disregarding cost effectiveness. And I think that's a big issue.
I promise will be very quick. Your question about if there is time, there was no time for Ukraine. They pulled it out. There was no time for COVID, and we pulled it out. Unfortunately, history tells us that you need urgency to pull it out. And unfortunately, I fear that Europe and this country, as we said in the previous panel, doesn't feel the urgency yet. But as they say, my strategy colleague, it looks like necessity is the mother of all invention. So we don't have time, but I'm hoping that like for Ukraine and COVID, when times come, that innovation system will pull out as we have done in the past. In terms of borrowing, if this is going to be funding procurement and a large contract to incumbent, I completely agree with you. It will be inflationary, it will not be sustainable. In my research, I have shown that when this is tilted towards R&D and investment, actually is almost paid for itself. And by the way, I'm going to say this exactly because I'm speaking before the Chancellor. Increasing borrowing for investment and R&D doesn't break the Chancellor rule. So in this country, it's possible to do it even without changing any commitment. Regarding Vannevar Bush and Draghi, my sense is that Draghi is trying really to do what Vannevar Bush did. And by the way, the Vannevar Bush model is exactly what China is doing now. Massively investing in innovation with many, many competitors and many firms, accepting that many of them will fail. Here we don't have that culture of innovation and competition that Philippe Aghion taught us and that Draghi is trying to implement with his report. I think this is exactly the bottleneck.
And I say also, well, I want to disagree on one thing. I think that you cannot have a panel that says, my God, Russia is here, we have to do something, and then worry about public debt. I think that if there is a necessity to do what we need to do, I think we are going to do, you know, the war financing type of public debt. It was done during the war and just also after the war in what economists call fiscal dominance way, so with the Federal Reserve pegging interest rate to finance a low cost the US government debt, and this was not inflationary. It's inflationary only to the extent in which growth is not generated in the long term, and to the extent in which the government is not credible in its commitment to consolidate at some point. Okay, but I mean, we have to kind of wake up, I think.
Thank you. We have time. Speaking of time, one more question right there. Oh, sorry. Oh, so do we have a microphone? Sorry, can we get that lady in the blue scarf and then the gentleman in the black t-shirt? And we'll have to be very quick if we.
So I'll just ask the question without mic. I don't.
Sorry? Okay, I think we may have to. Yeah, we've literally got 1.5 minutes left. So why don't we thank the panel for their. Sorry about that. We've had a bit of a technical problem, but thank you so much. This was an absolutely delightful introduction for me to a bunch of very difficult and very complicated topics. Very enlightening. Let's give everybody a big round of applause. Please stay in your seats. So
that's the most important.
Except
Stay
for
in your
us.
seats.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the closing session of this LSE Bruegel joint event on security in Europe. How will it affect growth and competitiveness? I'm Angelo Martelli, Assistant Professor in European Political Economy at the LSE European Institute, and it's a pleasure to welcome the Right Honourable Rachel Reeves, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Jeromin Zettlemeyer, Director of Bruegel, for this final conversation. Europe is currently facing two concentric tensions. The inner circle is represented by the underlying tension between the need for greater integration to achieve the scale necessary to address shared challenges, and on the other, the preservation of national sovereignty. Simultaneously, in the outer layer, there is a global tension between technological progress and institutional change. This was eloquently described by this year's Nobel Prize winner, Joel Mokyr, who, recalling a conversation with Douglas North, stated that while technology advances, it's cumulative, it's getting better. In other words, progress. For institutions, there is no such trend. They go up and they go down. This is why we talk about institutional change. If we don't reconcile these two, it's going to be very difficult to have an outcome which is not quite devastating. We must therefore develop and promote advanced policy work grounded in solid academic research that addresses these tensions, and at the same time push back on the isolationist pressures of the past and also the more recent ones. We hope that today's joint event is making a small contribution in that direction, and we are delighted to host this final conversation on the role of the EU and UK in a new multilateral system. Before I yield the floor to Jeromin Zettlemeyer, let me remind everyone to please keep their phones on silent and to remain in their seats at the end of this conversation. Without further ado, please, Jeromin.
Thank you so much, Angelo. Chancellor, welcome. Super happy you are here. It's a big honor. We'll talk a bit, perhaps starting with the theme of this conference, which had to do with the economic aspects of defense and procurement, a little bit about the UK-EU relationship, and then I wanted to ask you a few questions on topics that all European policymakers are concerned with, where the UK perspective is particularly important, I think. So maybe to start with a question that's closest to the topic of this conference. So you may remember we met for the first time, I believe, about a year ago in April, actually last year in Poland, which was a similar theme. And at that point, we presented a paper which argued that we needed a much more dynamic defense market, more competition, more entry, that the way to do this was to create something like a single market for defense production, transcending the EU. The argument that it has to transcend the EU is very easy to make, both because you would obviously want the UK industry to be in there, but also because EU law doesn't actually allow it in a legal sense inside the EU because of a treaty stipulation that creates a carve-out for national security. So you have to do it intergovernmentally anyway. And then we added this idea of a common funding mechanism for common defense assets. So, I mean, really two questions. One is, what did you think of the idea? And the other one, would you join? And the other one is, it was at that point generally convinced this was the most meaningful thing that certainly I had written since joining Bruegel, and that people would just suck it up, that as we were standing here, the organization would exist. And unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. So politically, it does seem to be quite difficult, particularly from getting away from home bias in defense procurement. And what is your interpretation? And do you see a political path in this direction? And where might that realistically leave us, that path?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here today as well. I start by saying I strongly believe that Britain's future is inextricably bound with that of Europe's. And that is for economic reasons that I'm primarily responsible for as Chancellor, but also reasons of security, resilience and defence, which is where you've started this conversation. And I enjoyed meeting you in Warsaw last year at the informal ECOFIN. I'm very pleased to be invited to Eurogroup and ECOFIN meetings now. It's been a long time since the UK Chancellor has been at those meetings, and I think it is very important for these discussions that the UK is in the room, and I'm very pleased that we are in the room again for those discussions. And I was pleased to discuss with you then those opportunities for not just Europe, but countries that share each other's values to cooperate more on defence. And the reason I say not just Europe, but Canada, for example,
Indeed.
and Mark Carney's speech in Davos a couple of weeks ago about the importance of middle powers who share each other's values, working together, not building fortresses. And the same arguments apply on the economy, but the urgency in defence, I think, is unarguable. Russia is not going to sort of sit on the sidelines and wait for the next ECOFIN meeting, and we need to crack on as well. And so I sort of share some of your frustrations that these conversations have been going on for a while, but we haven't yet come to a solution. But in terms of what I think is needed, and I think there's common agreement here between us and many EU member states and others, that we clearly spend a lot on defence. We are all going to be spending more on defence in the coming years. We're taking our spending to 2.6% of GDP, biggest uplift in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. But I don't think any Chancellor or Department of Defence actually believes that we are getting the value for money that we should from that spending. So things like interoperability, joint procurement, not every country in Europe are having different specifications when they're buying a helicopter or a ship or a tank or other equipment. The potential for stockpiling, possibly off government balance sheets, all of those areas, and lending, but lending at the lowest possible cost for countries so that we can get better value for money, that money can go further, and what we buy can be used together between the countries that are part of any agreement. So I very much liked the paper that you wrote and the ideas that Bruegel has put forward. I want to give you some reassurance that we are absolutely taking those ideas forward. Many European finance ministers and defence ministers are keen to seize the opportunities there, and I hope that in the coming weeks there's more to say on that.
That would be wow, great. Yes, thank you. We have been waiting for so long. Now you're saying coming weeks. No, that's great. Maybe to broaden it a little bit to the subject of the UK-EU relationship. So it has noticeably improved under Keir Starmer's government. And so the question is, where do you see ourselves now? So what of, in a sense, the government's agenda has been achieved in terms of a reset with the EU? what more can we do within the political constraints, and maybe a possible analogy. So I went to Switzerland a couple of months ago. They, after a very difficult negotiation, negotiated an agreement with the EU, which is, I think, better than the TCA. It goes further in the direction of single market without quite getting there. And basically, intuitively, the way I understand it is that they look at each sector separately and try and integrate to a maximum extent, following single market rules, but they do not do it for the entire economy. And so the question is, could that be a template, and what are areas where you would think we should be doing more progress?
The economic plan, the growth plan of this government is to try and remove barriers for businesses that stop them from investing, from trading, from enhancing productivity. And one of those barriers, of course, are trade barriers. And there's plenty more. But on the theme of our discussion, trade barriers are too high. And, you would have seen that this government over, the past year and a half have been, busy signing a number of trade deals with the US, with India, and the one with India we hope is going to come into force in the spring this year, which will be quite an achievement given we only signed it a few months ago, a deal with the Republic of Korea at the end of last year. We're working with the GCC, the Gulf countries, on a deal. The Prime Minister was in China just a couple of weeks ago, working with Switzerland, who you've just mentioned. But the biggest prize is clearly with the EU. And we have made progress there, and thank you for acknowledging that. We were very clear in opposition that we wanted to have better trade relations and a greater degree of trust between the UK and the European Union. And our Cabinet Office Minister, Nick Thomas-Symonds, along with our lead official, Michael Ellam, and our Ambassador, Lindsay Appleby, have been working really intensely to rebuild that trust that was lost not just at the time of the referendum, but actually in the years leading up to the referendum. And I do believe that we've made big progress in that area. We've already agreed the Erasmus student exchange program, which I'm so pleased about, because it was seemed to me when we left the EU, it made no sense that we would at the same time take away those opportunities that many of us had from our children and future generations. And so we're very pleased to have secured that deal, and we are working on implementing what was agreed between Keir Starmer and Ursula von der Leyen and the teams at the summit last year on SPS, a food and farming agreement, on energy trading, including around CBAM, on electricity trading, and on an ambitious youth mobility scheme. And I hope that very soon we would have made more concrete progress in some of those areas. But as we said at the time last year at that summit, that was sort of first base, really. We wanted to achieve those things. The truth is, economic gravity is reality. And almost half of our trade is with the European Union. We trade almost as much with the EU as the whole of the rest of the world combined. And so, I'm all up for doing deals with India and the US and Korea, but none of them are going to be as big as what we can get through better trade relations with Europe.
And so, Chancellor, do you have a vision for what could be second base? And by the way, I'm very glad we are still using American sports analogies here after everything that has happened.
I'm not very good at sport, not even sure what would a European analogy be?
I think we should keep the transatlantic relationship going. I firmly advocate baseball analogies, particularly in the land of cricket. So what could we aspire to as the next step?
So I think further integration will require further alignment. But I'm up for that. My government, Keir's government, is up for that. And we are keen to go through at a sectoral level what areas we think we could have deeper alignment in. And some of that could be unilateral and some of it could be negotiated. But I think there's big opportunities there. I was with Valdis Dombrovskis and Maroš Šefčovič just a couple of weeks ago in Downing Street. We had really productive meetings about, what the future might look like. And, we've made good progress this last year, but I think there is more to do, including in the area that I'm most responsible for in the Treasury around financial services, where myself and the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Lucy Rigby, has been having meetings with Marie-Louise Albuquerque around financial services. And, there are sort of three big financial centres in the world. There's New York, there's London, and there's Hong Kong. And London should be seen as an asset for the whole of Europe. Not just for the UK, but for the whole of Europe. And we want London to be that asset. We've got real challenges, shared challenges across Europe, in a lack of access to capital for scale-up businesses, by poor productivity and poor growth performances, really since the financial crisis. And the City of London is part of what we have to offer the EU. And whether it is on defence or financial services, we don't want to create more barriers. We want to be bringing those barriers down. And especially going back to the first area we discussed on defence, we want to greater integrate supply chains, not damage them by taking a sort of inward-looking approach. And other countries around the world are looking inwards and increasing barriers at the moment, whether that's on trade, on movement of people, on investment. And we want to show that there is a different path. And there is a path that leads to greater prosperity for our people. And I believe that that path is from one which is around openness to trade, to investment, to business, to talent. And that is what we're trying to pursue in the UK. And I think there are obviously big similarities. You look at the Draghi report and the conversations I had with Valdis and Maroš a couple of weeks ago. Our challenges in the UK are the same as the challenges in all of the member states across the EU, but we've got a better chance of succeeding if we work together in that shared endeavour. There are three big trading blocks in the world. There's the US, there's China, and there is Europe. And we want to make Europe as strong as possible. And that means not putting up the drawbridge. And I know we did that when we voted to leave, not me.
No. That's right.
But the country made that decision. But I believe that there is an appetite, and we saw that when we had the summit last year, when, look, politically, we were worried there was going to be a lot of pushback saying, wait a second, we voted to leave, or why are we going to be making it easier to trade again? And, where does this lead? And even with the ambitious youth mobility scheme, I think Erasmus is one of the most popular things that we've done as a government, because it is about giving hope that there is a better future, and that we are ambitious for Britain, for our young people. So I am confident that this is a political argument as well that we can win.
So I'm glad you mentioned trade, because I wanted to leave it for the end, but you essentially got so much into the substance that let's just continue along that path a little bit more. So I think there is a shared sense that we obviously want to reduce trade barriers among ourselves, number one. Second, that we are interested in an open trading system, which is being, at the global level, right, which is being threatened from several sides now. I'm not sure that we are so clear on the continental side on how to reconcile this generic objective, which our fears, particularly about China. And so from what I can see, the Commission is not being particularly clear on how it wants to address the trade-offs between, say, an industrial policy that includes local content requirements, a procurement policy that focus on buy European, all of which can arguably be justified as ways of, spending money to support your own industry, and then the underlying multilateral vision. And, even Mr. Šefčovič has published an FT editorial a few weeks ago where he argued that for most people, and certainly trade economists in this room, would be pretty much the sacred principle of the multilateral system, which is the most favored nation, the non-discrimination principle, might be up for discussion. So I think I see the EU as unsure, as vacillating on the principles that you expected. I'm actually really sorry that you guys left, because I think the discussion might be different if you had stayed. And so I would like to ask you how you see these trade-offs, because, you will face them the same way we do. You are also, victims of Chinese overcapacity, or what you call it. So, but you seem to be a bit firm, I think, in your defense of openness than what I hear from Brussels.
So the UK and Europe have benefited from the rules-based system. And I believe in the rules-based system and the benefits it brings to the developed world and to poorer countries as well. But I'm also not naive about the world in which we live. And we are in the world as it is, not in the world as we might like it to be. And I do think the sort of shocks that have come all of our way in the last decade or so do show the need to build more security and resilience into our domestic economies, and the sort of old idea that it didn't matter where things were made or who made them, I think that is for the past. If you look at the impact on Europe, the economic impact in Europe from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's been severe because we were over-reliant on Russian oil and gas.
Yes.
If you look at the impact of the pandemic, we were over-reliant on PPE and medical supplies from China. If you look at future growth areas, whether that's in clean energy or tech or indeed in defence, we are over-reliant on China for critical minerals and vital parts of those supply chains. And I think that it would be an economic mistake and a security mistake not to build in greater resilience and security into our supply chains. But that is not the same as building barriers between countries that share each other's values. And so why I actually support the idea of some sort of made in Europe or made in countries that share each other's values. I think that is sensible and precautionary in the times that we live in, but I think if we can make as broad a club as possible. And I don't think it makes sense to exclude the UK or Norway or indeed Canada from schemes that are trying to achieve something which I think is in all of our interests, which is to create greater security and resilience. And that is where, I don't agree with everything the US is doing in terms of trade.
Right.
But their diagnosis of the problem isn't all wrong, is it? Because, what they're saying is overcapacity in China is making jobs in Europe and in the US and in Canada and elsewhere unviable because the market is being distorted. There isn't really a market. And that isn't what the rules-based system was supposed to facilitate. And so I think it is right that we call it out when it's not working. But what I am worried about is, again, as Mark Carney said in Davos, every country trying to have these mini fortresses. And there should be, I think, greater collaboration between countries that share each other's values, because it's not in Britain's interest, it's not in France's interest to put tariffs on food or energy or defense or not just tariffs, but non-tariff barriers as well. And so I would like to build a bigger club of like-minded countries.
But, you know, I'm also concerned about developing countries, no? So I mean, I still subscribe to the idea that the WTO rules provide a minimum that we should try to adhere to and then strengthen collaboration. And then the question is, can we do trade defense of the type that is essential for economic security, for example, as you said, within those rules? How would you answer that question? Or do we actually need to effectively give up on the WTO and recreate a smaller club?
No, I'm definitely not arguing that we give up on the WTO or the IMF or the World Bank or the UN or some of the other things that some people would seem to be quite happy to give up on. But I guess if we sort of think about, obviously as a government, we thought, very sort of strategically and clearly about the Prime Minister's first visit to China. And there are areas where we absolutely want to trade more with China. There are massive opportunities for the UK. We're the second biggest exporter of services in the world, financial services, business services, culture, sport. These are great export opportunities. And there are lots of things that we want to investment and imports from China that we can benefit from, and collaborations in areas like life sciences and tech. But there are limits because in the end, any government has to always put its national security first. And so when it comes to nuclear power, and we're investing heavily in the UK in Sizewell C and in small modular reactors in Wales, we're not having Chinese investment in that because it is critical national infrastructure. We're not having Chinese investment in our telecoms system. We ruled Huawei out of that, and that was the right thing to do.
Of course.
So I think, as you say, it depends on what you're talking about, and there are some areas where I think we can be very relaxed, and there are other areas where no, there are limits.
Chancellor, I'm going to ask you two more questions. You being the Chancellor, there's no way I cannot ask you one question about fiscal issues. Then we will end with a question on growth. So I think the UK and I would say about half of European EU countries have in common that they are trying to reconcile fiscal adjustment with a whole bunch of other stuff, like maintaining or improving the quality of public services, raising defense spending, and dealing with headwinds that are frankly outside our control, which is largely demographics. It seems almost an insoluble problem. I mean, we have a framework to do this in the EU, which is called the medium-term fiscal structural plans that each EU member has to put up. They promise some fiscal adjustment targets, say broadly how to do this. I don't think that most of these frameworks will be implemented the way they're formulated. It's very hard. And so what is your take on how to reconcile these conflicting objectives?
Yes, I mean, sometimes the sort of G7 finance ministers meetings, there's like a therapy session.
Exactly.
We're all grappling with the same challenges, absolutely. Yes. And I became Chancellor just over 18 months ago. And one of the first things I did was to reset the UK's fiscal rules. So the first of our rules is that day-to-day spending should be paid for through tax receipts. And we set a timeline on that. It will be within 3 years. That's a rolling target. And then the second is that subject to bringing debt down as a share of the economy, we will invest in things that will improve our longer term productivity and growth. So capital investment is outside the first of the fiscal rules, which has enabled us to invest £120 billion more over the course of this Parliament in capital expenditure, as well as starting to count the benefits of investment and not just the cost. So our debt target takes into account net financial liabilities. And so those changes are helping us as a government to be able to invest in some of that infrastructure to improve the growth rate, because I very much believe that if you think that fiscal policy is just about tax and spending, you are never going to get in the sort of virtuous circle you need to be in. It's growth is the best way out of bad debt dynamics. And so part of our fiscal plan is our growth plan, which is the #1 priority.
Maybe you can elaborate on that bit.
Yes, yeah. So, you know, our second rule is that we'll get debt down as a share of GDP, but that depends on the numerator and the denominator.
That's right.
And you can have a bit more debt if you've got a bigger economy. And so, you know, our growth plans are about being able to make our debt affordable, as well as the improvements in living standards that you get from a healthy and a growing economy. So that growth is so important to us because it's about living standards, it's about having the money you need for public services, and it's making our public finances more sustainable. But of course, even when you've got 120 billion pounds more to spend than we inherited, there are still difficult choices, because we want to invest in nuclear energy, we want to invest in carbon capture and storage. We need to build more housing because home ownership is going backwards, and there's huge problems of hidden homelessness and overcrowding. The train and the tram links in between our cities and within our cities hold back our productivity, especially in the north of England. And we need to spend more on defence. And so, you know, one of the difficult decisions I had to make as Chancellor, along with the Prime Minister, was to reduce our spending on international assistance, on aid. And we reduced that and made a commensurate increase in spending on defence. That was not an easy decision, especially for a Labour Chancellor, but in the world that we live in today, I believe that that was the right choice. Now, we have a particular sort of fiscal legacy that we have to deal with, which is the sort of aftermath of the Liz Truss mini budget that elevated UK government borrowing costs compared to our G7 economies before then. Our borrowing costs were roughly in line with other G7 economies. We now spend about 10 or 20 billion pounds extra a year compared to our counterparts on debt costs because of that premium that we've been paying. It's receded a bit in the last year and a half. We were one of only 2 G7 economies last year that saw government borrowing costs fall, but we need them to fall a way bit further before we are back in the G7 pack. One of the ways that we're achieving that is by sticking to the fiscal rules, by building up additional headroom in the budget last year. And as the IMF have said, we've got the fastest pace of fiscal consolidation in the G7, where this year the current budget balance should be around 4.5% of GDP, and then falling in every year over the forecast period. So, you know, there is fiscal restraint in the UK. At the same time, because of the changes to the fiscal rules, especially on capital investment, we have been able to unlock a lot more spending. We have also unlocked spending through increased taxes, which has its sort of, you know, pros and cons.
I am a tax resident of the UK, so I painfully acknowledge the fact that you have raised taxes.
Well, yes, I believe
you were right to do so. You were right.
You're home in Britain, you should pay your taxes here.
Absolutely.
We're very pleased that you do. But, you know, obviously you've got to get that balance right. And I think that is for all finance ministers, trying to get that balance right between borrowing, which is more expensive than it was a few years ago. We should have been borrowing when interest rates were near to zero, rather being forced into do so when they are higher. We have a plan to bring inflation down. It should be back at target, the Bank of England say, I think in the second or third quarter of this year. And all of those things, I believe, will result in lower borrowing costs, which frees up money to either you know, help keep taxes down or to invest more in our public services, both of which are very important to this government. But growth is one priority because it's about living standards, having money for public services, and improving the debt dynamics.
And just to summarize, the way you have, you know, focused on the growth objective is through the composition of spending on infrastructure and by reducing trade barriers. And is there anything else you want to mention as part of essentially the growth plan
Yeah, so our growth plan is sort of really a modern supply side approach. So it's not it's not demand side led.
Sure.
It is about addressing the sort of long-term fundamental weakness in the UK economy, which I think is similar to a lot of developed economies, especially in Europe, of poor productivity and poor growth, particularly since the financial crisis. And so what we're trying to do as a government is to move out of the way all of the barriers that are holding back investment. And you'll know that we have the lowest investment as a share of GDP of any of the G7 economies, and pretty much at the bottom of the OECD league table as well. And so we are trying to get to that through a number of policy levers. So the first is on planning reform, so a non-fiscal lever where we're making it easier to build stuff in Britain, whether it is transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, housing, reducing the time it takes to get consents for planning, reducing the ability for judicial reviews to hold up investments, and backing big things like Heathrow, third runway, Gatwick, second runway, the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, Northern Powerhouse rail. So a mixture of planning reform and capital investment. We're also reforming our pension system and also personal savings to get more money invested in UK listed and non-listed equities and into infrastructure. We've got the second biggest amount of assets under management in UK pensions of anywhere in the world, and yet they are heavily skewed towards government bonds and very and under-indexed in the UK and infrastructure and venture capital, which means lower returns for savers and also lack of access to capital for growing businesses. That's another way in which we are removing barriers. We're reducing the regulatory burden. We've committed in this Parliament to reduce the regulatory burden on business by 25%, leading the way in financial services, where we're making it easier for banks and financial institutions to lend, changing things like capital requirements, making it easier to lend to home buyers, and also changing the rules around the individual savings accounts. So more of that money has to be invested in UK stock markets or in stock markets. So a number of changes to try and make it easier for businesses to invest and choose to invest in Britain. And that is where the reducing trade barriers comes in as well. And indeed, things like making it easier for talent to come to the UK, whether that's through our global talent visas or indeed, I hope, through a more expansive youth mobility scheme within Europe as well. But very much focused on the supply side of the economy, boosting investment to start to bring up our productivity and growth rates. And there are already some positive signs that productivity has begun to pick up after being in the doldrums for many years. We would have been the fastest growing big European economy this year. I think we will be the second or third fastest growing economy in the G7 last year, and the same again this year. So we're doing some of the right things, but the truth is none of our growth rates are high enough. And so there is lots more that we can do, both at the nation state level, but also working together to remove some of those barriers that are holding back investment and productivity.
Amen. So thank you so much, Chancellor. And
thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Chancellor, for accepting our invitation on behalf of the LSE European Institute and Bruegel. Can I ask to please remain seated until the Chancellor has left the room? Again, thank you all for attending this event and for the great fireside chat. Thank you. Very much.